Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Okay, I want to thank the JPA Development Committee, who have been working very hard for a long time on many details that it took to bring this conference together. Also, John Beebe of San Francisco, whose idea this collaboration was. He's a Philemon scholar and the author of the book at the core of this conference. And, well, we'll be hearing from him today. Also, thanks to Adam Fry for helping to shepherd our committee through the preparations. And special thanks to Ikuko Acosta of NYU for helping us get this venue together. So, thanks to Ikuko Acosta of NYU for helping us get this venue together. And now I'm going to hand the microphone over to Beverley Zabriskie.
Good morning. Welcome. As a member of the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association, I've had the great pleasure in the past to work with Ikuko Acosta, the JPA, and the NYU Art and Arts Professions departments put on the 4-day Art and Psyche in the City conference a few years ago, and so she's our great hostess, and certainly we're extremely grateful. As a member of the Helix Center, I would like to thank Helix for all their help in producing and supporting this event. There are flyers of the Helix programs on the table. And then as a member of the Philemon Foundation, which is working toward the publication of all the unpublished works, along with, as I will say in a moment, the heirs of Jung. I have had the great pleasure of having contact with and working with Thomas Fischer, and also with the Philemon scholars who were here, Ernest Falzheder, Craig Stevenson, and John Beebe on the Types book. So you can imagine what it's like to be the great-grandson of Jung and Emma Jung, C.G. Jung and Emma Jung, when we all think they belong to us. And really, the responsibility of the literary estate is really one that belongs to the family. And Thomas has been most gracious ever since he's taken over as director of the Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung. Thomas Fischer, Ph.D., studied history, political science, public and international law at the universities of Zurich and Brussels. He's the director of the Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung Zurich, established by the community of heirs to maintain and develop the literary and artistic estate of Carl Gustav Jung and his wife Emma Jung Rauschenbach. The foundation manages the intellectual property rights to this heritage and strives to foster a scholarly publication of their works. And as I mentioned, he is the great-grandson of C.G. and Emma Jung. Thomas, we're so pleased you're here for this occasion. Thank you. And so he is going to say a few words.
Beverley and the JPA, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to say a few words about the Foundation of the Works of C.G. Jung. But before that, let me congratulate you to putting together this conference. I think it's a great event and a wonderful occasion to talk about this publication that came out a year ago, I think, where John and Ernest have been working for a long time on it. And it's a wonderfully achieved edition, volume, and I hope most of you find it an interesting read if you get a chance to dip in it. So for the foundation, maybe it is important to mention, because you refer to the family, the family, the descendants of Jung, they transferred their rights, the author's rights, into the foundation in 2007. And formally, we are totally independent of the family today. The whole board is currently set up with family members. But nevertheless, this makes working much easier, taking decisions, working with our partners, Jungs Foundation, editors, publishers, the archives. And that is sort of the network we play a certain role in. We play that role because there's the copyrights on Jung's work, and copyrights, at least in Europe and the United States, they still last for 70 years over the author's death. So that's the main reason why we have a say in all this. Of course, there's a few more reasons also. Not the least, access to material. The bulk of material has been deposited to the university archives of the Technical University in Zurich, where Jung was teaching. But still, there remains material with the closer family archive and in private possession, scattered all around. And what we are trying, among other things, is keeping track of where things ended up and bringing this into new publications. And for example, Craig Stevenson, who is here, he just finished this wonderful edition on a lecture of Jung on the French poet and writer Gérard de Nerval. And we were able, just by sheer luck, I'm almost to say, to find minutes of the discussion that has been taking place after he gave the lecture. And this was a wonderful piece to discover. And it was partly because Craig was working on this edition. When sorting through some of the materials, we actually became aware that this belongs to that lecture. And, this is what we try, among other things, adding the pieces together, making new projects worthwhile. We are a non-for-profit organization. We may sound like much, but I'm basically the one person working. And not a full-time. I do have a part-time assistant because I privately reside in Canada these days. So there's someone in Zurich who assists me twice a week. And like that, we are set up. And then obviously depends on finding good partners, competent people who are able actually to make the editions when it comes to publications. So yeah, the Jung, Schmid, Guizot letters we're talking about today, they're a very good example of such collaboration. And maybe Beverley yesterday asked me also to say maybe something about ongoing projects and new projects, because there's the fair question, so after the Red Book, what else is there to be published? And again, here the question of the psychological types is a very good example. So collected works have been published. That's the main stack of manuscripts that he wrote. Then there's lots of letters. Most of you are aware there's 2 volumes in English on the letters by Jung. They contain about 3,000 letters, I think. In the archives in Zurich alone, there's something like 35,000 letters. Not all of them are worth publishing, of course, but still, there's a lot. And it becomes interesting then when you find the counterparts of the letters, as in this case, where you see Jung engaging in a discussion and hopefully additional material, eventually contextualizing the whole thing. And that makes for a new, interesting publication. This is a worth project. Other things, the black books, the raw material to the red book, they are currently being edited by Sonu Shamdasani, again with the Jungs Foundation. We're also working with independent scholars, currently working with a young French scholar who is planning an edition of letters in Jung had with Francophone-speaking colleagues and people. So I'm trying to help him to make the selection, directing him to additional people. He's very good in, he came up with the project, and then first of all we need to take a decision whether we support this. After all, at one point we have to release the material for publication. But then we're trying to foster his work and being of help in making this coming to fruition. In the end, also an important point is finding a publisher. Princeton University Press, who is now again very active since Philemon's involvement with the works of Jung, and we're very grateful for that. Yeah. So maybe a last point to mention here is authentication of the material. That's an important step. So what now happens sometimes is that someone shows up and says, like, I found this document in an archive, and I think it's, maybe 3 pages, and I think it's something Jung presented somewhere. And then we try, the first step is like, please send us a copy, and we try to figure out whether this is really Jung or whether these are notes on the talk that he gave. And if that step is taken, then you may start to discuss, does this belong to something bigger, and is it worthwhile going into a public editorial project, or does it fit in with something going on elsewhere? Also, if new primary source material shows up, we try, and someone is, like, rather than it is auctioned, we try to bring it into the university archives. So we're trying to link. So I had this case last year also in France in the papers of Jung's first French translator. They turned up an original German manuscript, something that's been published in the collected works, but the original manuscript was no longer available. So this turned up, and then we sort of acted as an intermediary between the archives who finally bought this paper from these people, which was a wonderful thing. So sort of completeness also of the primary source material certainly is important to us. All right, I'll leave it at that. Just a few words on the publication itself. So most of you are aware this is the exchange of letters that is at the basis of Jung's book Psychological Types, published in 1921. And Jung has explicitly acknowledged Schmid-Guison's role and contribution to the development of his manuscript in the introduction to the book. I think it is worth pointing out that this is not just one of quite a big number of substantial correspondences in the Jung archive. This is really a founding document of the discipline of analytical psychology, and the timing is important here. So this occurs. This correspondence between Jung and Schmid-Guison occurs mostly in the summer 1915. And Jung, at the time, is working in the Black Books. And he takes sort of in a hiatus, this takes place. So while working on his inner side, he also engages in this scholarly exchange, but where it's an exercise in defining a new terminology and a new theory. So, and the two actually then result in what we now term analytical psychology. It is also the time that the psychological club in Zurich is founded, 1916. So that is the first group where Jung sort of has interaction with his own disciplines, so to speak. Around that time he writes the Septem Sermonis ad Mortuos, which can be seen as a personal foundation stone of Jung to the making of analytical psychology. It is around that time Jung drops some of the Freudian terminology from his works. So it's really him coming into his own school, so to speak. And this is, in my view, the significance, among other things, of this document here, or this publication. Good. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to present a few remarks on our foundation. And I'm very much looking forward to the presentations today. And I would like to thank the editors, all editors with Philemon and Philemon today, again, for the wonderful work they're doing for Jung and for keeping his literary estate alive. Thank you.
So on to our next speaker, and Bruce Parent.
So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Ernest Falzheder to you. He has a PhD in psychology, is a senior research scholar at the University College London, and a senior editor of the Jungs Foundation, where he is engaged in the translation and publication of the complete works of C.G. Jung. He has written, edited, and translated more than 200 publications on the history, theory, and technique of psychoanalysis and analytical psychology. Among others, he is the chief editor of the Freud Forensic Correspondence, editor of the correspondence of Sigmund Freud and Carl Abraham, co-editor and translator of The Question of Psychological Types, and the English translator of Jung's seminar, Children's Dreams, a collection of selected essays, psychoanalytic filiations, mapping the psychoanalytic movement, will appear in early 2015 with Karnak Books. It's my pleasure to introduce Ernest.
Thank you, Bruce. Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. That's good. Okay. Jung emphasized time and again throughout his writings, letters, seminars, interviews, that he was not a philosopher, but an empiricist. Here is only a small selection of quotes. I won't read all those quotes. You can look for yourself. I'm not a philosopher. I'm an empiricist. I'm an empiricist, not a philosopher, etc. Next one. And that's only a selection of those quotes. So these are not isolated statements, but you'll find them throughout his works. So in short, he summed it up like thus: everyone who says I'm a mystic is just an idiot. So seen from that perspective, what philosophy is for Jung is that he sees it as a forerunner of modern psychology, as a precursor, and also, obviously, of his own psychological theory. And he thus positions his own theory as a contrast to, or an explanation of, philosophy, and not as a philosophical system itself. Now, things are more complicated, however, because in quite a number of instances, we find also very positive statements of Jung's about philosophy. At times, he all but admitted that he himself was a philosopher at heart. Quote, "Of what use is philosophical knowledge in the head if one is not also a philosopher at heart?" Or, "A rare philosophical passion is needed to compel the attempt to get beyond intellect and break through to a knowledge of the knower. Such a passion is practically indistinguishable from the driving force of religion." Or, "I've always been of the opinion that Hegel is a psychologist in disguise, just like I am a philosopher in disguise." But why in disguise? Because in former times, the psychologist would have been called a philosopher, but philosophy has been usurped by the academic faculties of philosophy and thus has become alienated from life. This is why people who professionally study the soul must concoct their own philosophy and call it, for the reasons mentioned above, psychology. He actually criticized Freud for having been too much of a doctor and empiricist and too ignorant in philosophy. Quote, "Freud wasn't much of a philosopher. He was strictly a medical man," something that would recall Jung claimed to be himself. "I'm just a medical man." Had Freud, Jung wrote, had Freud critically examined his own foundations, he would never have been able to put his peculiar psychology so naively on view as he did. I, says Jung, have never refused the bittersweet drink of philosophical criticism, which has helped me to see that every psychology, my own included, has the character of a subjective confession. And quite similarly, in the Tavistock lectures, I consider my contribution to psychology to be my subjective confession. The best we can achieve, he wrote, is true expression. True expression is a confession and a detailed description of what we found in ourselves. Now, but why should such a confession and an account of our inner experiences be as such already regarded as science? The question actually is, what is empiricism? What is a fact in psychology? Jung complains, for instance, and that's another quote, "The people prefer to ignore the facts I have discovered or to deny them without scruple. But it is the facts that are of prime importance to me and not a provisional terminology or attempts at theoretical reflection." He then gives a surprising example, however, of such a fact he had discovered, namely, quote, "the fact that archetypes exist." Now, this is a crucial point. Is the existence of archetypes really an empirical fact? Or is the concept of so-called archetypes not rather a provisional terminology and an attempt at theoretical reflection? The decisive leap is obviously from experience to theory, with the help of a specific methodology and terminology. And it's here, I find, that Jung differs from what is generally regarded as a scientific enterprise. Because, first, he sees manifestations of an alleged unconscious, such as dreams, already as pure nature, as the unvarnished natural truth. Second, and consequently, there would be no need to analyze them. We simply have to understand them. And his method to understanding was a kind of meditative circumambulation. Quote, "I regarded certain things again and again, and always from a new angle, because my thinking is circular. I circle around the same question again and again. That is the method that appeals to me." Even if we grant that this might be a legitimate method, it is, to say the least, a redefinition of what is usually regarded as scientific. All he could do was to compare. Three quotes. "All we've done is to compare individual psychic occurrences with obviously related collective phenomena." Or, "What I've practiced is simply a comparative phenomenology of the mind, nothing else. There is only one method, the comparative method." Or, "My scientific methodology proceeds exactly like comparative anatomy, only it describes and compares psychic figures." The comparative psychologist, says Jung, must not fight shy even of the most obvious and superficial analogies, however fortuitous they may seem, because they serve as bridges for psychic connections. It would seem to me, however, that in order to be able to compare, we need a standard of comparison, a scale, a reference point, which would give us the means to decide whether or not such a superficial and fortuitous analogy, for instance, is really meaningful and explanatory, instead of being caught up in endless circumambulations. At the heart of the problem is the fact that anything humans say about themselves is self-referential. and lacks, as Jung stated numerous times, an outside Archimedean point from which objective conclusions could be drawn. In other words, in psychology, as in philosophy, the observer and the observed coincide. And this is a central point in Schopenhauer's philosophy, who writes, "Even in self-consciousness, the I is not absolutely simple, but consists of a knower, the intellect, and a known, the will. The knower is not known, and the known is not knowing, although the two flow together into the consciousness of an I. But on this very account, this I is not intimate with itself through and through, does not shine through, so to speak, but is opaque, and therefore remains a riddle to itself." So how can we come to know ourselves, or indeed to know our self? Schopenhauer thought that there was indeed a way. We are not merely the knowing subject, but we ourselves are the thing in itself. Consequently, a way from within stands open to us stands us to that real inner nature of things to which we cannot penetrate from without. It is, so to speak, a subterranean passage, a secret alliance, which, as if by treachery, places us all at once in the fortress that can be taken by attack from without. Precisely as such, the thing in itself can come into consciousness only quite directly, namely by it being conscious of itself. To try to know it objectively is to desire something contradictory. Now try and replace in this quote, thing in itself, with the self. And I think this could have been written by Jung, if you read it that way. But is there really a subterranean passage that could place us in the otherwise impenetrable fortress? Can psychology really be an ordinary empirical science? How can it avoid to become Munchausen psychology, pulling itself up by the bootstraps, so to speak, or to endlessly go in circles? Will it really be possible for psychology to become what Nietzsche predicted, to become the queen of all other sciences? We're actually confronted with the question, what is consciousness? Which is an even greater mystery, I think, than the so-called unconscious. What is consciousness and what is self-consciousness in the original meaning of the word, namely being conscious of oneself and also being conscious of oneself. And is this self-consciousness a reliable informant of what really goes on, or is it a trickster, an impostor? As Nietzsche put it, does not man live by being constantly deceived? Does not nature conceal nearly everything from him, and in particular what is nearest to him? Into this consciousness he is locked, and nature threw the key away. End of quote. At times, Jung seemed to give us a hint that he did know where nature had thrown the key. In other words, that he had actually found that Archimedean point outside, or a self-referential system. Writing, for instance. We couldn't possibly judge this world if we had not also a standpoint outside, and that is given by the symbolism of religious experience. There would exist a spiritual goal, the points beyond the purely natural man and his worldly existence. And not only would such a spiritual goal be an absolute necessity for the health of the soul, it would also represent the Archimedean point, from which alone it's possible to lift the world off its hinges. So, but if Jung knew about the trans-individual, transcendental standpoint from which to lift the world off its hinges, why did he not say it out loud and clear and draw the consequences? And here we come to something that has troubled many serious students of his works, namely his way of writing. Jung himself complained repeatedly and bitterly about being constantly misunderstood, and that only a chosen few would be able to understand him. There are only a few heaven-inspired minds who understand me, but most people are ignoramuses. Or, unfortunately, I've very often had the experience that I was called the Dark One, like Heraclit. Yeah? Later, I became gradually convinced that the confusion was not in my head, but in the heads of the others. Sometimes we also find hints, however, that his not being understood was perhaps not only due to the limited intelligence or confusion of his audience, but that he held back something on purpose, that he didn't tell everything he knew or believed to know. Quote, "I have had experiences that are unspeakable, as it were, because one can never really tell them, and because nobody can understand them. They are dangerous, because 99% of the people would declare me mad if they heard them from me, and catastrophic, because the prejudice they arouse when disclosed could block the other's access to a living and wonderful secret." Here is what Jung said about himself and his personality in an interview. "I have intuitions about the subjective factor, the inner world. What I see are most uncommon things, and I don't like to talk about them because I'm not a fool. If I were to speak of what I really perceive, practically no one would understand me. I've learned to keep things to myself, and you'll hardly ever hear me talking of these things. That is a great disadvantage, but it is an enormous advantage in another way. For instance, I come into the presence of somebody I don't know, and suddenly I have inner images, and these images give me more or less complete information about the psychology of the partner. It can happen that I know an important piece out of the biography of the person, and I'm not aware of it, and I tell the story, and then the fat is in the fire. The things that are interesting to me, or are vital to me, are utterly strange to the ordinary individual." A stunningly open self-diagnosis, one could say, if I had not taken the liberty of using a little ruse or subterfuge by replacing, in this quote, the term intuitive introvert by the first person singular, by I. Still, Jung so often portrayed himself as an intuitive introvert, regardless whether he was one or not, but he portrayed himself as one, that I think we're justified in applying this description to himself. So, if it was preferable to stay silent about those real important things anyway, why did he publish hundreds of articles and books, write, Thomas spoke of 35,000 letters, give so many lectures, seminars, interviews? It seems as if he simultaneously did and did not want to disclose that secret, so that the language he used was very often deliberately obscure. His books, he wrote, reveal as much as they disguise. It was his explicit intention to write in such a way that fools get scared away, and only true scholars and seekers can enjoy its reading. Or, I try deliberately and consciously to use ambiguous formulations because they are superior to unambiguous ones and correspond better to the nature of our existence. He does not write very clearly, said Marie-Louise van Frans, but he does that on purpose. He writes with a double attitude, giving full justice to the paradoxes of the unconscious. Buddha once said that all his sayings were to be understood on two levels, and Jung's writings also have this double floor, these two levels. This reminded me of Nietzsche, who had written, "Everything profound loves masks." Or as Nietzsche wrote elsewhere, and Jung might have agreed, we do not only want to be understood when we write, but also, quite as certainly, not to be understood. It is by no means an objection against a book if one or the other person finds it unintelligible. Perhaps this might just have been the intention of the author. Perhaps he did not want to be understood by just anybody. But then, why shouldn't it be possible to point out and try to explain in a lucid, clear, and scientific way something obscure, ambiguous, complex, full of tension, or even contradictory, instead of mirroring and duplicating the obscure and ambiguous form in which that something presents itself? And are Jung's ambiguous statements always deliberately obscure? Take his writings about the archetypes, for instance. On the one hand, he often kind of hypostasized, reified the archetypes as if they were cut in stone. On the other, he warned against doing exactly that. Throughout his work, you will find him switching between talking about concrete archetypal images, or the so-called Urbilder, some of them in quite a naive way, as I find, like his picture of the 2-million-year-old man who could just be asked if one ran into trouble. And on the other hand, you will find warnings against taking the archetypes literally, stressing that they should be seen as quasi-instinctual patterns or invisible laws. The archetype would be like an invisible law of crystallization, for instance, not the resulting crystal. Another example would be Jung's use of the term psychology for both the theory of the psyche, the logos, the science, psychology, and on the other hand, for just the subjective viewpoint of an individual. So when he talks about my psychology, for instance, my psychology is my confession, you actually are not quite sure. What does he mean? Does he mean his theory or his prejudices, his own personal viewpoint? Or maybe he means both. In fact, even the title of his book on typology is misleading. It should read psychic types or psychological typology, not psychological types. Many have also found it difficult to come to terms with Jung's concept of God. Sometimes he treats God like an old personal acquaintance. Think of the turd God was shitting on the cathedral in Basel, or his famous dictum in the face-to-face interview, I don't need to believe, I know, or the picture he paints of God in answer to Job. But at other times he claimed that he was never speaking of God as such, but just of the empirical fact of the self-archetype and nothing else. As is well known in Memories, Jung talked about his inner dichotomy, the play and counterplay between personalities number 1 and 2, which has run through my whole life. Although he was quick to assert that this pair of opposites is played out in every individual, it seems safe to assume that this dichotomy was particularly distinct in his case. I would like to suggest that in Jung's theory, this dichotomy is reflected in his oscillating stance toward a philosophical, metaphysical, even religious approach on the one hand, and a natural scientific perspective on the other. Although psychiatry and then psychology seem to offer a way out of this quandary, he remained caught up in it. To put it a bit provocatively, one could say that he wanted to create the science of dreams, and he ended up with the dream of a science. In the Red Book, there is a striking passage in which Jung enters into a dialogue with the figure of Izdubar, or Gilgamesh, about the poison of science and about different types of truth. Izdubar, miserable worm, where did you suckle on this poison? Jung? O Izdubar, most powerful one, what you call poison is science. You call poison truth? Is poison truth, or is truth poison? Do not our astrologers and priests also speak the truth, and yet theirs does not act like poison? I don't doubt that your priests speak the truth. It is certainly a truth, only it runs contrary to our truth. Are there then two sorts of truth? It seems to me to be so. Our truth is that which comes to us from the knowledge of outer things. The truth of your priest is that which comes to you from inner things. We had no choice. We had to swallow the poison of science. This poison is so insurmountably strong that everyone, even the strongest and even the internal gods, perish because of it. Science has taken away from us the capacity of belief. What? You have lost that too? You have lost that too? How then do you live? We live thus, with one foot in the cold and one foot in the hot, and for the rest, come what may. Can you bear it? Not particularly well. I personally don't find myself at ease with it. Now, if we take Jung's statement seriously, namely that his inner dichotomy has run through his whole life, I'd like to suggest that his choice of psychiatry and psychology as his profession was in itself an attempt to come to terms with this dichotomy. In fact, I would go even farther and say that we could view his entire work and theory as such an attempt. That is, I would call it an attempt to find a superior standpoint, to reconcile, to understand, and to come to terms with these two extreme poles. This took various forms. How am I doing in terms of time?
26.
Yeah. 10, 15 minutes, would that be okay? Yeah. So this took various forms, his attempt to find a superior standpoint to reconcile those opposite poles. But I will still leave out, I've had a look, for instance, at his association experiments, which could be seen as an example, to investigate number 2 with the stopwatch in hand as number 1, for instance, or his work on schizophrenia, the psychology of dementia precox, or also his book on transformations and symbols of the libido. But here I'd like to turn to typology. I find it crucial that in Jung's own assessment, the core of his book on psychological types was not the typology, but the problem of opposites, even if most of the readers, as you note, have not noticed it. This was not Jung's first attempt to tackle the problem of opposites with the help of typology, however, and it wouldn't be the last. In fact, I would like to present a view here that might surprise some of you, and say that one could make out a quaternity of typologies in Jung's work. The first nucleus of such a typology can be found already in his study on the associations of normal subjects, written together with Franz Rieklin and published in 1904 and 1905. They had found that some individuals tend to react with internal associations, that's a quote, and others with external ones. In other words, quote goes on, two easily recognizable types emerge. First, a type in whose reactions subjective, often feeling-toned experiences are used, and second, a type whose reactions show an objective and impersonal tone. This type can be called objective. So his first classification distinguished between subjective and objective types. In the wake of his book on transformations and symbols of the libido and the energetic concept of the libido developed therein, Jung then developed another typology in distinguishing between the two different directions that libido can take and flow, inwards or outwards. The first he called introversion. The second, at first, with Freud's term, transference. So it distinguished between introversion and transference. In a further step, he then renamed the second extroversion and linked these two for the time being, and that's where he stood in his exchange with Hans Schmidt-Guissin. Linked these two, he linked introversion with thinking and extroversion with feeling. He stated at that time, we're talking 1913, 14, 15, that these two types are not only characteristic of pathological states, that's how he introduced them first, as characteristic of hysteria and dementia precox, respectively, but then found out that there may also be normal human types who are distinguished by the predominance of one or other of the two mechanisms. And then he made a still much more far-reaching claim. Not only would these two types characterize people, but also theories, and particularly theories in psychology. Thus, Freud's theory could be described as extroverted, and Adler's as introverted. And as in Freud and Adler, these types would also lead, as he writes to Schmidt, will lead to viewing the world in the light of two truths. And these two truths would be two different but equally true perceptions of one and the same situation. The point is that Jung then went on to develop still another truth, namely his own theory of psychological types, which would explain why this was so. Implicitly then, this latter truth was of a higher order than the other two truths. Jung found himself in a logical dilemma because he used two different concepts of truth. The two truths he mentioned are actually just two different, if valid, perceptions or perspectives of one and the same situation. Something any marriage counselor could tell you about, you know? Or a police person asking witnesses, you know? One could say that he separated objective truth from subjective truth, the objective truth being his own theory of why people have different subjective truths. Coming back to typology, as you all know, Jung then presented a third typology in 1921, the model of two attitudes and four functions. And I won't enter into this here because you're all probably more familiar with that than I'm myself. Instead, I would like to introduce a fourth detailed typology that completes the quaternity, but has so far not yet appeared in print. At the end of the first semester of his lectures at the Swiss Institute of Technology in early 1934, Jung presented a detailed taxonomy of consciousness. The main question it addresses is, where does the light of consciousness fall? Now, we have a problem here, because according to all the note takers, Jung drew this diagram on the blackboard, and he wrote right on the left side, and he wrote left on the right side. And it's all about opposites and the tension between poles, you know? So I've left that standing and just ask you in your mind to keep in mind that when we are talking about the right side, look to the left. Okay? Anyhow, in the center, there is the subject, yeah? To which everything relates. And the sides, to the right and to the left, represent an ever-growing level of growing objectification or desubjectification. The levels get more objective and more abstract the farther we get away from the center. And now the right side, on the left, illustrates the outward going development, the side of consciousness. Now the impression, and now I quote Jung as he presented that diagram in the lecture hall in Zurich in 1934. He said, "The impressions of our surroundings that we perceive are not simply the objects themselves, but what we perceive are the images of these objects and persons." That is this realm, impressions, the images. We perceive things as they appear to us, and we're always caught in subjective prejudices that distort and disturb our perceptions. It is as if we were surrounded by an oddly deceptive fog through which we perceive things and which affects our perception in a peculiar way. And William James refers to the fog that surrounds us as the fringe of consciousness. The further things lie from us, the more objective we can be in the sphere of abstract ideas. That's here. an impersonal or not I way of looking at things exists, which is quite free from subjective prejudice. The abstract sphere also contains purely ideational groups, which are characterized by a particular idea, such as the state, the church, political party, and so on. They usually possess a symbol. Symbols such as the sun symbol belong to the sphere of the highest ideas, ideals, and that's a 4 right. Now the left side represents the dark inner side, the land of projections, the realm of affects and moods of an inexplicable nature. Dreams and fantasies reach us through this sphere, as well as so-called hunches and inspirations. This is the sphere of unconscious presuppositions which distort affects and ideas in the same way in which the fog distorts perceptions on the other side. What corresponds to people and things on the right side, for example, that's 3 plus. On the right side are phantoms and ghosts which cause those affects, ideas, or dreams on the left side. Here, demons, for instance. The spirit world is the complete equivalent of the outer world on the other side of the diagram. As, for instance, in the case of the series of Prevorst, for whom this sphere was the real world, the ghosts she was dealing with and seeing. This was more real to her than real people, so to say. Yeah. And in some, says Jung, we have to envisage this diagram as if a light beam were moving along a scale, and where the light fell, that was where consciousness was. I actually wonder, and you might wonder with me, why Jung never published this concept. All the more so in that this new typology would neither devalue nor supersede or exclude his former typology, but would in effect be a perfect complement to it. As Jung points out, this new classification, quote, refers exclusively to the shifts of consciousness to its localization, to the localization of consciousness, whereas the typology of intro and extroverts, the 4 functions, shows us the quality of the personality that is the bearer of this consciousness. Okay, to conclude, we can say that Jung was actually always quite touchy when he believed that he was not seen as a dyed-in-the-wool empiricist and scientist who simply dealt with facts. As a matter of fact, however, he was often perceived as something else, and perceived by both of his critics and admirers, who both often saw in him a mystic, a gnostic, a religious man, a prophet, or even compared him to Jesus or to Buddha, as we heard from Marie-Louise von Franz. Were all these people just idiots? We also know that up until the end of his life, he had great doubts as to whether he had not failed, had not been properly understood, and hadn't succeeded in conveying his real message. But then, with his deliberate use of obscure and ambiguous language to scare the fools away, his conviction that only a few heaven-inspired people could understand him, how could he expect to be taken as a traditional scientist? Did he not rather fall into the trap of playing the role of the prophet himself, which he allegedly tried to investigate scientifically. Actually, this reminded me a bit of Nietzsche, who was, as you know, like Jung, the son of a preacher man. And Nietzsche also, he never tired of preaching against preaching. However that may be. At one point, Jung did question his style in a surprisingly self-critical way. And I find this really a very, very interesting quote. "I was shocked to realize," says Jung, "I was shocked to realize that I can be quite complicated when dealing with complicated things. But this is only adequate when one wants to seem deep and profound. But in reality, this is nothing but an identification with the topic one deals with." Indeed. So, did Jung wear his alleged scientific stance as a persona, a mask of respectability behind which he hid his religious orientation? In a letter to Father Victor White, he wrote, quote, "My personal view is that man's vital energy or libido is the divine pneuma, and it was my secret intention to give my colleagues an understanding of this conviction. When you want to talk to scientists, you cannot start with a religious creed. If I were talking to peasants, I certainly would talk about God, since I know that they know of what I'm talking." This was Jung's dilemma. He seemed to believe he had found that Archimedean point, but couldn't say it out loud, because it would be viewed as, well, as exactly as what he has been viewed by many anyway. Half crazy, unscientific, woolly, mystical, etc. So in the long run, his strategy didn't work out, it seems. However that may be, I think we may be justified in saying that there is indeed a double floor to Jung's writing, and that he tried, and sometimes despaired, his life long to speak the unspeakable, to give intimations of the one great truth that cannot be adequately put into words, but of which he was convinced that it indeed existed. I would call that a philosophical enterprise. Thanks. We've got 15 minutes for questions.
We promised ourselves we'd work together once more. So I've had the chance to read this paper before and hear it. And each time I have the same interest in it, that it seems to me to be one of the very few pieces that I've ever read about Jung's way into psychological types that, as Jung loved to say about the alchemist, washes the material in its own water. Because it seems to me that what you've done, Ernest, is look right at the surface of what Jung is saying about what he's doing with psychological types. You're sort of almost taking your principle from Oscar Wilde that only superficial people insist on looking beneath the surface. And you stay right at the extroverted sensation level of what Jung said he was doing. And you give us the massa confusa of exactly where Jung was at exactly the time he was putting together psychological types. Because it was just then that he was discovering and identifying with and living out his own inferior function of extroverted sensation. So he ends up in some peculiar kind of science, which is very like Goethean science, where Goethe goes all over the mountains looking for the flower, as if he can find that one flower, he will have actually found the archetype in a scientific way. So you get aesthetics, you get religion, you get mountain climbing, you get deep sea diving. It's a very experiential, wild ride that calls itself science, but it's really some kind of adventure that I think ends up a peculiar philosophy of how you do psychology. So you just take whatever you've experienced and make something of it, and somehow out of that, the typology is born. That's how I see it. And I think you've taken us there as to how you did that. So I'm very grateful to this. Very, very grateful to this.
Thanks, Johnny. It's actually a bit funny for me because I wanted to get beyond typology and taking the bird's eye view on typology, so to speak. And now John tells me I did it from the standpoint of an extroverted sensation. Okay. I'll just have to take that. Thomas.
Thank you, and thank you for your interesting talk. I have a question and a remark. The question, and I totally agree on the ambiguous language in Jung's work, and you can see he's shifting from being overconfident to totally insecure. Now, I did mention in my opening remarks that Ernest, and he alluded to it, so he's actually editing some of the ETH lectures which ran throughout the 1930s, and this is out of that series he presented here. And do you find that the language Jung uses there is as ambivalent as it is in the corpus of his written works? Because you need to be aware that he was presenting at the ETH for a general audience, for engineers, of course. All his group was there as well, like those who knew, but there were others. It was the free elective course program he was teaching in, and I mean, one of the expectations why we think it is worthwhile publishing that from the notes that people have taken is because it's a different language. But I wonder, do you find that? Does he speak sort of more straight, more clear? So that's the question. And just a remark, I mean, Jung being called the mystic and everything, and him being so cautious to stress that he's an empiricist and everything. I mean, we can laugh about it today, but it was in everyday life that was a challenge. My grandmother tells me there were some of her the children in her class were not allowed to go play in her house. He's a nutter. You don't know what this crazy guy is doing to people. And that has been Zurich in the early 20th century, and many people felt like that. Just saying, one shouldn't forget that, although I fully agree on what you say.
Well, I didn't want to make fun of it, so that would be a complete misunderstanding. To Jung's lectures at the ETH, maybe I might say a few words about the background. Jung was appointed professor at the so-called Eidgenössisch-Technische Hochschule, which can be translated as the Swiss Institute of Technology, still one of the best universities of the world. And he gave a series of lectures starting in late 1933, winter semester 33-34. And 4 people took notes, and we're collating those notes, and we'll publish the notes of these lectures in an 8-volume series with Princeton University Press. And I'll publish 4 of those volumes, and among them the first volume with that typology in there. And to answer your question, yes, his language is much clearer, much more to the point. I mean, there were 600 people listening to him. they had to move the lecture to the biggest hall, lecture hall, auditorium of the university. And I mean, everybody came, you know? People from all walks of life. Hermann Hesse came by and listened to him, and other people, and you know, students. And actually, he asked if his listeners, if people understood him, and they complained that he was too popular. So he should speak more about more complicated things. But he didn't carry it through. So the last lectures on alchemy, I think that's true for the first 2, maybe 3 semesters. And then also his audience dwindled. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ernest. That was just fantastic. And from my perspective as both a professor of hermeneutics and an analyst, I can feel what Jung is trying to do, going back and forth between truths he can talk about, which are statistical truths, right, which seem like typological constructions, and then individual experience, which he says in volume 8 that you can't talk about because they're perfectly unique to that individual. So don't you think that as typology gets more complex, it eventually becomes attached to a particular individual, then it's not a typos anymore?
Well, of course, everybody has their innermost truth that is unique. Yeah. But I think what I wanted to show is just that I think we have to be careful when talking about truth. And there are indeed different kinds of truth. And I think the danger in Jung is that he mixes those different kinds of truth up and confuses his readers. And I talked with John yesterday. Was Jung really such a good thinker as he thought he was? and I doubt that a bit. Think of how bad he was at mathematics. I mean, he was not your ordinary logical abstract thinker. His kind of thinking was different. And so what I tried is to maybe show a kind of guide through how to read Jung when he talks about truth. That's all I tried. Thanks.
My question is in regard to Jung's oscillation between these two different points of view. And is it possible for him to have done otherwise? Could he have strictly spoken just as one or the other? And it's similar to what you were saying about, sometimes he talks about the archetypes as these specific images revealed, and other times as a capacity or a function or a law, a way and mode. And is it possible to do both of those knowingly? Science doesn't do this, for example. Physics is still looking for the Ur particle as if that would exist. The way Goethe was with the plant. To be conscious of that is to know when you're hypothesizing and when you're not, and then make it clear in each case. Science typically does not do that. It oscillates between them. And Jung seems to, from what you were saying, if I understood you, be oscillating as well. Is it possible to do it in any other way than that?
I think your question is the answer.
Great.
Or you have answered your question yourself. One more? In the back.
Thank you. Couldn't this oscillation be considered between 2 points, like when he talked about the waterfall and being the water itself, the medium that goes between one and the other, and his genius was exactly being able to stay with the focus, going from one to the other, and express it on both ends? And does that make sense at all?
Yeah, it's like in Heisenberg's, I don't know the English term, Unschärferelation. Do you know the English term? Once you observe something, you alter the state of that what you observe.
Exactly, and he was the matter itself. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
the point was in
Yeah.
that book.
That's actually what the whole talk was about. That the observer and the observed coincide and influence each other, and how can we escape that self-referential system? And Jung's way was one possible attempt to do that. And as we've heard also from other people, there is a paradox that is inbuilt. We cannot escape that. That's part of our human condition. So I think, yes, you're right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We'll make a short break of 10 minutes. Thank you.